that kind of leads us on to the next sample, which is I'm now going to the AR open item file. And what I want to do there is illustrate a one-to-many relationship. In a one-to-many relationship, what we have is, for example, in this case, one customer and potentially multiple open items, or potentially no open items. And what I did here, what we're looking at then is ODBC, the ODBC access, which is either SQL or XDBC to get at the back-end databases. We're looking at that, and we're looking at a combination of the customer file and the AR open item file. Now, a customer may have no open sales, or they may have many open sales, or one open sales. So in this case, you can see, for example, we have a whole bunch for Neptune Underwater Supply. These were ones I put together for the demo on the X-Charge, the credit card processing. So I put out a bunch of stuff for Neptune. So they've got a bunch of stuff out there, but you can see that what we've got is a repeat of the customer number and customer name for each case and city and state. But then it's looking up different documents for each of these items, an invoice, a payment, and credit, and so on and so forth. So all of this data from E over to J is coming from the open item file. All of this data is coming from the customer file. And since there are going to be, in some cases, many records for one customer, what's going to happen is the data is repeated, so that the net effect is our consolidated records have all the customer data and the open item data in one record, even though the first portion of this is being repeated many times. So this is what happens with a many-to-one situation. You end up with repeats of the one and individual or the unique items in the many over here. Now, this is where it can get kind of complicated, because I said that you could have 0 or 1 or many. We've covered the 1 or the many in this case, and that's fine. But what happens if there are 0? Well, I said before, if there are 0, the way we've set this up by default is we're not going to see the customers. And any of you who have used our test data, our demo data, know that we have a lot more customers out there than this small number. Well, there's a remedy for that, and that involves changing the nature of the linkage. And so this is the fourth major issue I wanted to talk about. If we edit the query here, I'm just going to skip over these and go into Microsoft Query. We've got what I hope is becoming a familiar scene, which is our our two tables. I'm going to put customer file and AR open in the way I like to think about them. That is kind of the master file going to the 0, 1, or many records in the AR open item file. And once again, the link here is going to be on customer number and customer down here, and you can see that link. But what I'm going to do here is I'm going to double click on the link itself. And what we're going to see is we're automatically and blindly taking some options, and we actually want to change this. The default option when you create linkages is what in database terms is called an inner join. And an inner join basically says the only records we're going to include in our query are ones where there is a match between both sides of the linkage. So in this case, we're only going to take the records from the customer file and the open item file where they are equal. And that's why we're only seeing data down here that corresponds to people who actually have open items. If, however, we do what in this case would be called a left outer join, meaning the left-hand file is always going to show the data, and the right-hand file data will only be showed when there's a match. All files from customfile 00 and only records from AR open where they are equal. If I then choose that one, actually first I have to remove this and then choose this, add it, and then close. If I then refresh, right now it hasn't refreshed. We're just looking at the way it was. by default, when I run a query, this is maybe another 4A in our list of hints. When you do this kind of stuff, unless you have a very limited data set, which is a useful thing, by the way, it's very useful to not have an automatic refresh. Because if you have 250,000 records out there and you make a minor change to add a field or to add some sort of a filter or something, each time you do something, so to speak, each time on your debugging rounds as you get closer and closer, you may end up spending 5 to 15 minutes waiting for this thing to gather the 250,000 records altogether. So I highly recommend that you make sure that whatever client application, be it the Microsoft Query or Crystal or whatever, you turn off the automatic query function and only invoke it when you actually do want to do a test. Otherwise, you'll be wasting a lot of time. So that's why this is the same, and we're going to just click this and update it, and now you notice that we've got a whole bunch of blanks. Now, what's happening here is that we've got all the customers from our customer file, and then still in those cases like before, we've got those customers that have one or many invoices out there. So this is a one-to-many link, but we're now bringing in all of the left-hand side, all of the customers in this case. And in this case, then when I return this to Microsoft Excel, and it updates, and now we've got all of these blanks. Now, this now presents a bit of an issue because what are you going to do with this? Well, generally speaking, once you have this, you can copy this data into another sheet and actually get the data as copied. So you can actually paste the values. And these values will go in as blanks, which means you can sort them out of the way. This may be useful, may not be useful, but I'm just saying that in these cases where you're doing a left outer join or you're doing a one-to-many, including the nulls on the right-hand side here, when you're doing that, you may have to do something with these fields because, of course, they don't have the dates and the other stuff that you want into them. Now, that becomes much more of an issue when you're doing something more sophisticated, such as writing a report using, for example, Crystal Report Writer. And so what I have here now is the same situation with Crystal Report. Customer number, name, state, yada, 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 down to the apply to numbers. I'll be dealing with Crystal Report in a couple of minutes in a different way, but you can see this is still pretty crude. I haven't updated most of the titles. I've done a couple of things and moved some fields around. But what we're dealing with here is if we look up at the database expert, and again, the places where things are is a little bit different depending on the application, but the concepts are all the same. Again, we click link here, and now you see what should be the familiar from Excel setup here from the customer file to the AR Open Item file. The sequence of the fields are displayed as they are coming from the data dictionary as opposed to Excel, which are alphabetized. Again, a minor difference. And again, here in Crystal, it does an analysis of the keys so you can match. So, for example, in Crystal here, you see all the reds are all together. That set of 5 fields corresponds to one key, one major key. That set of 5 yellow fields corresponds to another key. So it's giving you hints. And Crystal is kind of sophisticated this way. One of the reasons I like the package. Anyway, by doing the same thing, I'm going to highlight this guy and double-click him. And notice we've got our inner join, which is only the customers, only the open items and customers together which match. And what I want to do is a left outer join, which should, let's just make sure that that's gone the right way. Customer file to AR Open Item file, left outer join. So I'm now going to say OK, and I'm going to close. And it's going to tell me, do I want to refresh the report? Yes. And now you can now see the spaces. So exactly the same thing is happening in Crystal as it happened before. But in Crystal, I have a few more options. And one of those is the fact I may want to put up a message in here. Now, depending on whether or not you're using, and this is some of the differences, the little minor differences between SQL and XDBC, this data may come through as blanks or it may come through as nulls. But what you can do is you can add a calculated field in Crystal that says, if it's any of these things, put up a special message. And this is, again, supposed to be not a particular, it is a particular example of kind of programming, but I want you to be able to have the idea that with these more sophisticated programs, like the report writers in both Access and Crystal, you have options after you've got the data in for post-processing it, for creating calculated fields. So, for example, I've created a calculated field called fixed document number. And if we open up the field here, what it says is, if it's a null field, then put up the message, pass back for this particular field name, pass back the name, no open items. Even if it's not a null field, let's do an additional check to see if the length of the field is greater than 0. So does it have contents? If that's the case, then use the data, otherwise put up no open items. So that's just an example of the kind of post-processing you can do on these null fields or these blank fields that are coming through. And then what happens is, having gotten that, I can drag this into place. Excuse me, there we go. Let's just make it smaller. And now you can see that all the ones that are missing this data back in here are no open items, and all the ones that actually have data actually have the document number. This can be important because if it brings back a null field, that's different from blanks and zeros. And unfortunately, in most of the major programs, a null field causes, in effect, the application not to abort, but to return a null. So if you do a length of a null field, you don't get 0, you get a null field. If you do an if statement on a null field, it just drops through whatever is there. So there is an operation here, the is null in Crystal, the is blank in Excel, and the is null also in Access, to actually check these fields to see if they are null, and then to put a value in there that you can actually test. Put in an if statement and say, if it's null, then put in NULL. And then in your if statement, you can say, if this value is a null, then I do this, and I don't add these together or do whatever. Or if it is not a null, then I can assume that it's the right values, and I can go ahead and do whatever I wanted to do with them. So this is just an example of what I'll call the null processing on the linkages. And the null processing comes typically from this one-to-many relationship where there is nothing out on the other side, and you want all the customers, all the employees, all the vendors, or whatever is happening here.